My name is Dr. Stephen Scoltetti, and I'm a member of the faculty at the University of Mississippi, where I serve as director of the Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom. The mission of the Declaration Center is to ensure that students, faculty, and citizens across the state of Mississippi have an opportunity to study freedom in an academic way. The Declaration Center supports its mission in a number of ways. It supports a Freedom Studies minor and offers student scholarships and fellowships. It also sponsors faculty research, and it offers a number of public events. One such public event was a recent lecture delivered by Dr. Neil Rogachevsky on the American roots of Israel's Declaration of Independence. This particular event was made possible with the generous support of the Jack Miller Center for Teaching America's Founding Principles and History. I hope you enjoy it as much as we did. Obviously, part of the thing you think about when you hear the word freedom is, well, what does that mean? How is that related to ideas about liberty? How is it related to ideas about independence? What do we mean by these terms? How should we think about these things? And here's one way I've often sort of thought about this. What if, in the contemporary world, we brought a group of people together in contemporary America, and we asked them to sit down and write a new Declaration of Independence? So we actually got people in a room and we said, okay, everyone, what are the self-evident truths that we all would agree on, by which then we would declare independence? How would that work? What would we say? What would the process be? Who would we invite to that meeting? It's an interesting question, and it kind of makes you think about how we might answer that question differently now than was done back in 1776. And the exciting and interesting thing, however, is this doesn't need to be just an abstract thought experiment. And in fact, when I met Neil, and he told me about the book he was writing, which was recently published by Cambridge University Press, it's called Israel's Declaration of Independence. It turns out that in mid-20th century Israel, before it became the State of Israel, a group of people actually did come together, and they had to decide, when the State of Israel was created, how should it declare its independence? What should go into that document by which this state would declare its own independence? So it's not just an abstract thought experiment. We have a real world example. And I don't know how many gripping page turners Cambridge University Press is publishing these days, but I will say that Neil's book is hard to put down once you start. It's a gripping tale, and so it's wonderful. So it is my pleasure then to introduce Neil Rogachevsky. Neil earned his PhD from the University of Cambridge, and he's currently serving as the Associate Director and Assistant Professor at the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought at Yeshiva University, where he researches and teaches Israel studies and political philosophy. He's published in a number of prominent newspapers, a number of prominent journals, and then, like I guess I've mentioned several times now, he's published this terrific book with Cambridge University Press. So please help me in welcoming Neil to talk about this fascinating book. Thank you.
Well, very good to be with all of you. Thank you so much, Professor Scoltetti, for that very kind introduction. I'm thrilled to be here in this incredible university, in this legendary town, and especially at the Declaration of Independence Center's mission I consider so vital. In this lecture, I'm going to attempt to tell one part of the story of the founding of the State of Israel and its central founding document, its Declaration of Independence, issued on May 14th, 1948, in the midst of its war of independence, exactly 75 years ago. This year, Israel marks its 75th birthday, and if you're following the newspapers at all, it's doing so in tranquility and tremendous calm as it's wont to approach social and political questions. Yes, the country from 1948 until today has rarely had a dull moment. But as should be clear, at pretty early juncture in this lecture, my story I think will be germane and relevant, as already indicated in introduction, to the work being done at the Declaration of Independence Center here, and anyone who's interested in America's Declaration of Independence, the American founding, and interested into the inquiry of the nature of the American regime. Because in a story that is, in part a slapstick comedy, which I'm going to give you some highlights of in a moment, the first draft, really the drafting process of Israel's Declaration of Independence began with America. It was a verbatim copy of America's Declaration of Independence, an attempt to bring the principles so profoundly elucidated in Philadelphia in 1776 to Tel Aviv in 1948. And so to study the Israeli founding, and that's one of the purposes that we try to take on in the book, is one way also to inquire into the journey of the principles of the American founding as they made their way through subsequent world history. And I profoundly believe, of course, two countries, very different experiences, very different personnel, very different time. But I do think that looking at these foundings side by side really can tell us a lot about both countries, ourselves, and our political possibilities. So what I would like to do here is I'm going to tell you this what I consider the remarkable story of the drafting of the first draft of Israel's Declaration of Independence, and then I'll speak about the final draft, both of which you have in the handouts which were distributed. And I'm going to give you some background. If you haven't the handout, I think there are plenty of copies up here. Throughout, so I'm going to give you some background history, but throughout my interest and my focus is really going to be on the level of principles. What ideas were these drafters grappling with? What were they trying to elucidate? And throughout, I'm really going to talk about what I consider the three key pillars of Israel's Declaration of Independence, namely the nature of sovereignty. What does it mean to be a sovereign state? What is sovereignty? What does it mean to govern yourself under an independent state? That's sovereignty. That's pillar one. Pillar two will be the relationship of religion and state, church and state, synagogue and state, however you want to put it. And third, the nature of rights. What are rights? What are individual natural rights? What are group rights? What are social rights? What are political rights? And fascinatingly enough, if you look at the American founding, you look at the Israelis together, you see them grappling in some remarkably interesting and parallel ways with these, I think, core pillars. So I'm going to focus on Israel, but from time to time I'm going to turn back and look at some of how I view the American, how the Americans in 1776 treated these principles, and I'll wait for the question and answer for you to correct me on my interpretation of 1776. So that's what I intend to do. Of course, this story is there are so many ways to tackle the question of 1948 in Israel, just as there are ways to tackle 1776. You have the whole question of the war. Many aspects, historical aspects. You have the question, as I mentioned, Israel's in the midst of extraordinary, you could almost call it a constitutional crisis in recent times, and the Declaration of Independence of Israel has played a prominent role in this. So I'm happy to discuss that, Israeli politics, other aspects I work on, whatever. So in the Q&A, feel free to, this is an interdisciplinary center. Yeah, feel free to, be wide-ranging. So if you have other questions, I'm happy to do my best to, try to address those as well. Okay, so a little of just very basic, bare-bones historical background on 1948. What was happening at that time before we get into the text of the Declaration of Independence itself. How did Israel come to the brink of independence? So the British had ruled Palestine under a UN mandate since conquering it from the Ottoman Turks in 1917. In the wake of World War II, the British Empire was, strapped for cash. They're very tired of policing the conflict between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, and they decide in early 1947 they're washing their hands of this conflict. They're going to reinforce their troops in Jordan, and they said, we're turning this over to the UN, but they really didn't they didn't themselves settle any diplomatic or political arrangements for what was to follow. They basically washed their hands of the situation. So the issue then comes to the United Nations, one of the first, you could say, the great matters before the UN. Remember, UN founded in the wake of World War II. And at the end of November 29th, 1947, the UN passes what was called Resolution 181, so-called partition plan, which is supposed to partition the land of Palestine, of British Mandate Palestine, into a Jewish state, an Arab state, and an international Jerusalem, combined with economic union between all three of those bodies. And the plan was actually it was quite UN-centric in a way. The UN was going to be there. They even envisioned blue helmets who were going to police a peaceful commonwealth existing between these new states. That was what was decided at the UN 1947. That vote was agreed to by both the Soviet bloc, the Soviets and their allies, and the Americans. The UN resolution was accepted by the Jewish agency in some disappointment. They thought the borders that put forward in that resolution wouldn't be defensible, but it was roundly rejected by the Arab states. There's an immediate boycott. Arab representatives walk out of this meeting, and the war in Palestine immediately begins. The UN, this carefully crafted UN resolution plan, becomes basically a dead letter on the ground. The war commences, and the first stages of the war, of course, while the British are still there, it's basically a war between the Jewish community and the local Arabs of Palestine, reinforced by some irregulars from some Arab states, but it's sort of a local conflict. So this creates a great void. Interestingly, the leaders of the Jewish community, they invoke Genesis at this moment to call it a political situation. They use tohu vavohu, the void and emptiness. So there was the political, the question of who was in charge was extremely murky. So they've got to figure out what to do. And they ultimately decide they're going to go for it. Once the British, leave, this is, slated for May 14th, 1948. The Jews of Palestine declare independence. The state is immediately recognized by President Truman, the first to do so. Soon afterwards, by the Soviet Union, and David Ben-Gurion, the indispensable founder of the State of Israel, reads the Declaration of Independence in Tel Aviv Friday afternoon, May 14th. He declares Israeli independence by virtue of the natural and historic right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate. Quite an interesting phrase with a lot of resonance we can discuss. He writes in his diary that moment, I mourn amidst the rejoicers, because he had very dark thoughts about the possibility of the new state to succeed. It was 600,000 people, surrounded by, Arab states. And then immediately after the second stage of the war commences, massive invasion by the Egyptians, Jordanians, and Syrians, principally, with some token contributions from the other Arab states. The 1948 war begins in earnest as an interstate conflict. Israel does hold on. The cost is tremendous cost on all sides. We can discuss that aspect of things if you like. But the state does manage to hold on with 1% of its population as a casualty. So, a serious cost. So that's the general background. That's the story of how they get to the brink of independence here in May 14th. So now I want to talk about the drafting of this text of the Declaration of Independence. And as you can just imagine, based on the summary, there's a lot going on politically that the leadership had to deal with, like the extraordinary challenge, where they were going to get weapons, reading the diplomatic tea leaves at the UN and in Washington, how would the powers of the world react to a Declaration of Independence, setting up the institutions of a state to be, It had only really been decided in April 1948, about 5 weeks before the British left, that they were actually going to go for it and to declare independence. So there's a pretty late outcome. All kinds of other possibilities were tossed around. And so the leaders of this political project, soon to be state, had a lot on their hands. So what do? They realize that we've got to have a text of the Declaration of Independence, and like good European bureaucrats, of which many of them were, what do? They delegate. They send it down the chain, right? Down to the lowest point in the chain. It's take you to late April 1948. It happens to be the Jewish holiday of Passover, Festival of Freedom. The justice minister, the country to be, a fellow called Felix Rosenbluth, he calls a young lawyer working in his office who had just been seconded there, 33 years old, a few weeks before, to help with this mad rush to build laws for a state to be. The justice minister comes to him and he says, "You write me a Declaration of Independence." He was just a young man with no political experience. He'd been in private practice, 33 years old. We were talking about this early this morning. I remember, that's actually the age Jefferson was in 1776. So that's kind of interesting also. But Jefferson's world experience, one could say, was a bit broader. So this fellow, a guy called Mordechai Beham, which the Israelis actually haven't heard of. I'm doing my best to introduce this into national lore. We'll see if it works. So he's perplexed by this task. There's a memo which exists from this the future justice minister, which says, you state the reasons which have brought us to this moment. But what we don't know, there's no record of this. What did he mean by that? Did he want something simply procedural? There are all kinds of independentist movements at the time, that don't necessarily see their task as making a world historical statement as to why we ought to be independent. What's the nature of our sovereignty? Why ought there to be a Jewish state? We have no idea what the actual instructions by this justice minister were for this young man. So he's horribly perplexed. He goes home. He's told to keep this top secret. He immediately, over lunch, he tells his whole family. And he says, "I have no idea what to do here," right? So someone in his family reminds him that there's a learned American rabbi living around the corner from them in Tel Aviv. Says, "You don't know what to do. You should go talk to this fellow." So this fellow, another character, it's almost too good. The story is too good to be true in a way, right? Print the legend. So he's 61 years old. He's an American conservative rabbi called Harry Davidovitz. And he is the most learned man in Tel Aviv, and he has this huge library. Now you got to understand what Tel Aviv was like in 1948. Now it's real city. At the time, there's I know 1948 in Oxford, Mississippi was a time of tremendous literary flowering. In Tel Aviv, no university, no public like one public library which had virtually no books. There was no place actually to get a documentary record. But this rabbi, who was a man of independent means, had this enormous library, in his private home. And so the young Beham, marched over to this person's house and spent an afternoon in that library. Now, again, we don't know we have no record of what the two discussed here. Much of some of this story actually depends on a family lore in an interesting way. But what we do know is this person, Davidovitz, was, as I said, probably one of the most learned men in Israel at the time. Totally unknown, totally unconnected to structures of power, but he spent his time not as a pulpit rabbi, but translating Shakespeare. He produced the standard edition, the standard Hebrew translations of Shakespeare, which were to be standard in the country for the next many decades. He had written a doctoral thesis on medieval Islamic and Jewish philosophy, extremely learned, but also, most importantly, a great knower and lover of the Anglo-American political tradition. And his family reports that he spent time reciting the King James, actually rabbi in Tel Aviv in 1948. One of his favorite texts, the King James version of the Bible. He loved the English Bible. and the other classics of of Anglo political and religious thought. So this person Baham spends his time in the library with the rabbi, and what he does is he copies out 4 texts. He copies the America's Declaration of Independence. He copies the English Bill of Rights, 1689, issued after the Glorious Revolution, some parts of the UN Resolution 181, and some texts of the King James Version of Deuteronomy. And 2 days later, he comes away. He writes this all in English, not in Hebrew, with the text that's actually the 3rd text in your handout there, the first draft of Israel's Declaration of Independence. Now, this text is really, to me, it's remarkable. To sum it up, I think, crudely, but I think helpfully, what he tries to do in this text is combine Philadelphia and Jerusalem. And you've all maybe some students of political thought here have heard of Athens and Jerusalem as the poles, the what those cities represent as being constitutive of our the political life of the West. In terms of political documents, what he does here is he tries to blend the teachings of the American Declaration, particularly on individual natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and governments instituted to secure those rights. That doctrine, he copies that verbatim and puts it in his Declaration of Independence. And also what he takes from the Americans, the unrivaled and so clear that we often don't think about it in the United States, that document's teaching on the nature of state sovereignty. Right? An independent state is truly independent. It can do what states do: conduct war, make peace, establish commerce. That the power for a state to do that is in itself and doesn't lie in any other body, whether higher or lower. So he adopts that doctrine of state sovereignty as well from the Americans. And what he takes from Jerusalem, the life of really, in a way, Judeo-Christian political tradition. I think either term actually would work in this context, is an idea of the covenant. So yes, our basis, we're going to have a Philadelphia basis in terms of the rights of citizens, but we're also, as he starts his Declaration of Independence, why are we here? He says, whereas this holy land has been promised by the Lord God to our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to their seed after them. So basically, that's a kind of invocation of one version. There are many. Some of you guys know the Hebrew Bible. There are many different versions of the covenant. That's you could say the simplest version of the covenant in Deuteronomy. We were promised the land by God. So that's what he tries to do. It's this remarkable attempt at a synthesis. And he realizes, in a way, with the help of the rabbi, or just somehow through this this process of reading, that these are really the poles around which a Declaration of Independence for a Jewish state had to revolve around. Right? It's going to be a modern state, a state of rights, a state in which there's every possible stream and inclination of Judaism around, and many people who are not Jews even envision at the time. Right, it's a state for Jews and non-Jews. It's simply a state. It's going to be a modern state. It's going to be a state where the principles of equal individual rights ought to be respected. So he recognizes that. But on the other hand, he says, okay, that's not enough, right? It's not simply, we can't, the purpose of the reinvigoration, he doesn't actually say it's new, this recreation of the Jewish Commonwealth has some connection somehow to the mission of the Jews, what we learn about the Jewish mission in antiquity as in the Bible. So that's what he tries to put together, and it's really kind of a remarkable attempt, I think, to do this thing, which we're dealing with in Israel today, many countries at the moment, right? How do you have a rights-based regime, but which can at the other time, like, is it possible to go beyond that? Are there other principles or other purposes to which we can turn, or which can be found in the state, even if they don't control the state? So this is what he tries to do. And I'm not going to go into the story of what the fate of this first draft here, but it doesn't stand at all, right? The story of I tell the story in the book. The subsequent drafters the subsequent editors who see this draft of the Declaration of Independence, they don't know what to do with this weird, what they consider this weird document, which is based on the American Declaration of Independence. And that's actually not surprising as it goes, as it climbs, this text climbs up the bureaucratic chain. It meets with people whose intellectual world, whose intellectual formation was very different, right? Who had in their lives, and I remind you, the founders of Israel were primarily from Eastern Europe, Eastern and Central Europe. Many, the most learned among them were, Weimar Republic era jurists. Their world, their mentality, their sensibility wasn't that of the Anglo-American political tradition. It's just something that they didn't come across, and didn't understand it in some ways. And so, in place of this first attempt, what they did is I tell the story in the book. There's subsequent drafts with entirely different intellectual basis. Here's one like pure arch secularist labor Zionism with Marxian undertones, stressing the power of the state. There's another draft which was simply internationalist, almost completely procedural, designed to, which of course is an important purpose of any Declaration of Independence, but this draft said nothing about principles or ultimate purposes, but was designed to sort of gain recognition for the state in the international arena. And that's basically where the process went until the night before Israel's independence. And I'll just, so I'll skip over this these medium drafts. I'll go ahead and come to the final draft of Israel's Declaration of Independence. So May 13th, 1948, British are leaving the next day. David Ben-Gurion, along with Beham, the most, I think at the level of ideas, the most important person in the story. He's a name you may have heard of, as the first prime minister of Israel, led the country for most of its first 15 years, and he was really sort of the indispensable founder of the nation, right? You could say, has a role that, there are other, of course, important figures, but you say he's kind of, combines a Jefferson, Hamilton, and George Washington in one. That really was, the scale of his importance in crafting the institutions of the modern state. So he gets what he considers a very bad draft of the Declaration of Independence on May 13th, with hours to go before the British departure. Late in the night, and he says, "Okay, I've got to do something about this." And it's sort of an interesting prehistory. This first draft was the one significant draft he actually never saw. He didn't see Ben-Gurion because it had been edited out of, by the time it reached his desk, it had been edited beyond recognition. He saw these subsequent drafts, which are just, briefly, the labor Zionist draft, the diplomatic draft, etc. And yet, Ben-Gurion sort of came in his own way to reckon with these three poles or three pillars, which I mentioned that Beham and the rabbi had treated when this process had started. And this really, we have to see, Ben-Gurion is really an extraordinary figure. And I think, in terms of the study of statesmanship in the 20th century, deserves to be better studied. He started out as sort of like he's from a lower middle class family in Poland, immigrated to Palestine, early in the 20th century. And by virtue of sort of political organizing, as well as reading, and reading great books, and this, another part, invocation of the important work of the Declaration of Independence that we were just talking about, Plato today, over lunch, partially by his extraordinary reading of, great texts, Plato's Laws was a favorite of his. He sort of came to a level where he was swimming in the seas of, high principles. He, by his own, really as a tremendous autodidact, he came to think, okay, this can't simply be a procedural statement. This is time to speak about national purposes. And what he does in this, what became the final draft of Israel's Declaration of Independence, he offers, I think, unique and very interesting, if somewhat incomplete, teachings or statements on these three pillars. So I'll just conclude by going through his version of what they are. What does Ben-Gurion teach us about the nature of sovereignty? What does he teach us about the question of the relationship of religion and state? And what does he teach us about rights? I'll articulate that and again and speak to some of the American similarities and differences. So maybe I'll start with the question of religion and state, because this is how he begins his Declaration of Independence. But Ben Gurion, if you've seen your handout, the very first paragraph, he writes this himself, sometime between midnight and 3 a.m. on the morning of May 14th, 1948, and he starts with a version of a different version of the work of the Jews in antiquity. I'll just read you this in English. This is the official translation. Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here they first attained to statehood, created cultural values, or really treasures, be a better translation of the Hebrew, of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. So this is quite, I think, an interesting attempt to invoke the religion of Israel for the nation of Israel. Ben Gurion has a big challenge here. He's surrounded by some people on some side who are very religious, or already just as today there's an ultra-Orthodox contingent who are in the room in the room of the big committee. Who are deciding these matters. There are arch secularists who want to say nothing really, who looked at the Jewish past as simply darkness, something to get beyond. Ben Gurion knows that that's not enough. He wants to, and what he tries to do here is he has to say, okay, our national purpose can't simply be ethno-national. It's not the people. People are. Every people is are entitled to a state. He's going to make that argument as well. But he says no. Somehow this state, the ultimate ultimate purpose of this state is to advance the universal ethical mission, which is contained in the Book of Books, which the Jews gave to the world in antiquity. Right? And the argument seems to be that for those principles or ideas or ethics to continue their journey through world history, the Jews ought to have a state, so that the work that they're doing, those ethics can be protected and safe. So what he does here is, I think there are all kinds of ways to quibble with it. I have many quibbles myself. But what he does, I think in a way he tries to do. I think actually here he's actually better than what Beham did. He tries to connect the particular and the universal, right? The Jewish work, this is important that the Jews did this, but those ethics, those principles are said to be universal. They don't belong, yes, like the Jews have a role in advancing them, but they're principles, according to the argument of the text, that belong to mankind. They're not simply to be confined to us, right? The ethical mission that we learn about in the Hebrew Bible is said to be universal, and that's the way he invokes the religion of Israel. And I think that's I think there's quite an interesting attempt, right? It needs a continued articulation and thought, but he avoids doing something which no one would have wanted, which was to say, okay, we're going to have a state of Jewish law based on the tradition of Jewish law that was impossible to conceive in 1948, and still today, no one, even those who say, there are a few people in Israel who say that, we want a state according to Jewish law, they can't actually tell you what that actually means, right? The whole tradition of Jewish legalism only arrived in a world, when post-political Jewish antiquity, so there's no precedent for that. So not that, but on the other hand, not simple secularism. The work, the mission, these ideas, which are said to have value for mankind, have to find a home in the state. But that doesn't mean Jewish supremacy. That doesn't mean one sect is privileged over another. That just means that somehow the ideas, the ethics, etc., will be protected. So that's Ben Gurion's teaching on religion and state, and I think that's kind of interesting, and a lot of parallels we can talk about in the Q&A and other political questions we're dealing with still today. Next, sovereignty, and here I think Ben Gurion speaks exactly, gives us the exact same teaching really that the Americans give in that penultimate paragraph, I think, of the American Declaration of Independence, where Jefferson writes, they have the free and independent states have the right to do all, conclude war and peace, decide the fundamental questions of statecraft. Ben Gurion says, and this is really, you could say, the golden, a golden sentence of Israel's Declaration of Independence. That's paragraph 10, second page of your handout. This right is the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate, like all other nations, in their own sovereign state. So Israel's going to be independent. It's not, and if I had more time, I could go into the whole diplomatic procedure at the time. There were proposals. The UN was, going concern at the time. The UN was looking to build, the UN was hoping to build a much broader version of itself than, subsequently was created, in which states were seen as partially sovereign parts of a new UN. That was, a goal of, many at the UN. That was this UN process was a diplomatic, even as I said in my intro, that the war had to turn this resolution from November 1447 into a dead letter. This was still internationally, it was clung to desperately by some parties, but Ben-Gurion rejects that. He says, no, we're not following a UN process, we're going to be an independent state. Now, that doesn't mean if there's peace that we can't, trade land, as subsequently happened. It didn't imply any of those, it didn't imply complete disregard for international processes. It just said we're going to be a state. We're leaving behind this, history of Jewish diaspora and where we live in a stateless way. Now, I think this, pretty much, so this teaching sounds pretty evident to Americans. Americans are used to, since the founding, used to living in state sovereignty, but that was so not evident in practice. I just intimated that through remarks, but also not evident theoretically to the Jews of Palestine in 1948. Ben-Gurion was cutting against, you could say, an apolitical tendency, which Zionism had fought against, but was still, in existence in the Jewish world in a major way in 1948, which held, our religion is so above politics. If you're in politics, you're making, you're dirtying your hands if you're forced to be in the world of politics. Ben-Gurion rejected that decisively. He says, no, we have no choice. We've been given lessons over the course of just the last few years, what happens when you don't have control of your own fate. We no longer accept this. We're accepting, perhaps some moral ambiguities, but also the, opportunities and responsibilities that come from sovereignty. So this is, that was this clear statement Ben-Gurion made was very important in this process as well. Finally, the discussion of rights. I'll just read this paragraph. So I actually, I think the final declaration is actually a little worse than Baham's draft, who simply copied, the states are, the purposes of states are to secure the individual natural rights of individuals. In place of that, we have a paragraph, this is paragraph 13, in which this Ben-Gurion didn't actually write himself, for the most part. It says, the state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles, will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants, will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture, safeguard the holy places of all religions, and it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. So this list was basically, there's some language on the prophets there, which obviously wasn't in the UN resolution, but this was a paragraph basically that the UN had said that any new state has to have a version of this, right, with social and political rights, group rights, individual rights, all these things sort of melded together in an expansive, you're sort of reminded of Roosevelt's Four Freedoms in a way when you're reading this paragraph. It's a very UN idea of rights. Nonetheless, here too, I think Ben-Gurion did something important and which moved this paragraph closer, or at least shows us what he was thinking, closer to the American idea of rights. So the penultimate draft of this paragraph had included language which says the state will bestow rights on peoples. And there are minutes of the debate over the text of this language. May 13th, 1948, day before, Ben-Gurion intervenes here, makes a fiery introduction. He says, you can't have a state bestowing rights. That's an incoherent notion. The rights belong to individuals. The state can merely protect rights. And so to convey that point, he changes the language. It's no longer the state will bestow right, but will guarantee or instantiate, would actually be the literal translation from the Hebrew, or ensure, as is in this official translation, ensure the rights of peoples. So what he does here is, I think he pushes the final doctrine closer to closer to the American view of, the rights, rights belong to people, right? Rights belong to individuals. They're not a gift of government to, bestow or take away. So this is, I think, very, so those are what I consider. There's so many other aspects to this, Declaration of Independence. I'm happy to discuss them. Those are, I think, the three key pillars. And what I tried to do is show you this interesting story, how it began with the American view of these three key pillars, and how Ben Gurion on this final night sort of in an interesting way circles back in a different way, to be sure, certainly on the religion and state notion, most decisively. Ben Gurion of those circles back to a kind of American view of independence. And I think this is pretty valuable work, right? This is not the end of any reflection on the nature of modern sovereignty or the nature of a modern Jewish state. But I think this is a beginning. This is a kind of document which is expresses a kind of liberal nationalism which can be constructive. It says, Judaism, speaks, it wants to, I don't know, Friedrich Nietzsche famously said the West is a magnificent tension of the spirit. I don't know if it rises to that level, but what it does is it tries to hold together these two things: the world of Judaism and its ethics and its heritage and its ideas, and the world of liberal rights. Now, I'm not like there was a movement in the 19th century who, they were called the Reformers, who said, "Oh, Judaism and liberalism can be the same," right? There are neo-Kantians, there are all kinds of people who try to, collapse, Judaism into, simply liberal, and to make them the same. I don't say that, but I do think these are ideas which, while not the same, can be held together pretty well. And the task for the modern Jewish state is to try to live these things. Maybe not to harmonize them, but to make that these make it so that these tensions are productive tensions, right? Creative tensions are only a little bit annoying, but which don't break the country apart, right? And in a way, this is the countries really live this way, right? You find religious people in Israel are frequently very annoyed that the government is always in violation of this or that aspect of Jewish law all the time, every day. The state does not, with a few exceptions, which were bought at the founding of the state. Jewish rabbis do not control the political life of the state at all. So there's some unhappiness of that. On the other hand, liberals, secular, to say nothing of the non-Jewish, are very inconvenienced by the presence of religion in the state, right? Try doing anything on a Saturday in Israel, right? It's quite inconvenient. Although there's pluralism, right? You go to an Arab neighborhood in Jerusalem on a Saturday, you can get best falafel in town is available. So you can either one doesn't need to be so strict on this. There are pluralistic ways to deal with this. So that's so I think that's how it's been mostly a livable tension, and it's permitted there to be a Jewish republic if they can keep it. So I think I'll stop there, and I'm happy to discuss any aspect of this, the Declaration of Independence, or other matters you may be interested in. Thank you.
I find it interesting that one of the freedoms guaranteed is freedom of language. Is there is there some sense as to why that particular thing was included? Something historical or in the moment?
That's an excellent question, and that's, again, you guys are the best exegetes I've encountered on this. It's extraordinary. That actually was added at the last moment. That wasn't in the list of rights. I can't remember whether that's in the UN Charter, or other language that the UN put forward at the time, but someone in the big executive committee which approved the text of the Declaration of Independence said, you've got to put you've got to put freedom of language here. The Arabs in our state and others, they have a right to use the language, their own language, right? That's that freedom which will be guaranteed, and it's kind of a remarkable achievement, actually, right? I think, right? Of course, the state hasn't always lived up to that. All kinds of problems. We all have our own views on that. But in the midst of this genocidal war which has been launched against them, they make a point of saying, freedom of language, freedom for this minority which is currently at war with us, but we recognize that there won't be a war in the future, and the rights of minorities, to speak in their own tongue, to worship in their own way, will be respected. So it's a pretty impressive thing. So that's one reason, and the other reason, the UN, what the UN wanted was determinative of some. I think they all agreed with this. There wasn't deep disagreement on no one was saying no, we shouldn't talk about rights. But much of the language there was drawn from the United Nations, language on what modern states had to do to be admitted to the United Nations.
Yeah, so I know you mentioned that the Jewish law is not at all in force in Israel. But I wonder, in this paragraph 13, where it talks about the Israeli state being based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the prophets of Israel, do passages like that ever get kind of legally interpreted with any kind of force or anything like that? That there's something about the particular Jewish interpretation of those principles?
No, it's very interesting. You should say that. I mean, this goes back to what you were saying before. I mean, this is framed. The prophets it's not Jewish peace, Jewish justice, or whatever. It's framed in this way. The prophets had this role in covering this. And again, it's not specific. That's why it makes it so murky and open or necessary to interpretation, right? The vision of Jeremiah is very different from the vision of Isaiah, right? Or at least they're certainly not exactly the same. So you'd have to do work there. But actually, there's interesting. I don't know if this tells you something or not. The way that's been interpreted by the Supreme Court of Israel in Israeli law has been basically exclusively in the universalistic direction, right? The Supreme Court doesn't usually invoke those specific words. It invokes the paragraph I read on the nature of rights. It turns to that a lot as expressing the general, universal, liberal vision of the state, right? But there's a sort of, it's originalism in a way has its limits here, right? Because you have, there are different ways to interpret this. But I'm glad that's there, actually, right? Because if you don't know, it's better to have interpretive confusion than having nothing to interpret. If you ask me.
Thank you.
I have two quick questions. The first is, from my understanding of your presentation, the coming together of this Declaration of Independence was almost kind of accidental or kind of last minute, but that doesn't quite kind of fit with my understanding of Zionist movements in the 19th and early 20th century and their very clear understanding of what an independent Israel would look like. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the movement of Zionism and the coming together of independence.
Yeah. So the name of the founder of Zionism is invoked in this text of the Declaration of Independence, Theodor Herzl, name you may have heard. But interestingly, there's and what they learned from him, and what's clear in the whole tradition of, not the whole tradition, because there are different versions of Zionism. There's autonomous Zionism, there's cultural Zionism, etc. But what's clear from political Zionism is this, the first pillar. That's what's got is sovereignty. That's what Ben Gurion. If you ask Ben Gurion, what did you learn from Herzl? It's we need a state. We're not satisfied with any other arrangement. If we don't have a state, we can. We're back in the history of the diaspora. It's like Golden Age Spain again, or it's Germany. We can build up all these institutions, but if we can't protect them, it's liable to be destroyed at any moment. No, we need a state, and that was you could say driving. That was you could say the lesson of Zionism, which accompanied Ben Gurion and a few others in 1948. But on the other hand. The main figures of the Zionist literature, such as you may be thinking, had remarkably little to say about what we'd see like the character of the state, right? What would it look like? Would it be pluralism? What kind of laws would it have? What would the government look like? what would the principles be? Because they were simply far away from the actual historical moment, right? When Herzl was, Theodor Herzl lived, died in 1904 in Vienna, he was extremely far out. This was not even, on the horizon. So one of the reasons it's interesting, actually, to study these people in 1948 is they had to look broader. They look in other places, right? Like, Mordechai Beham, even if he hadn't read Locke's second treatise of government, was turning not to Zionist literature, but to Lockean liberalism when he quoted the Declaration of Independence. Ben Gurion was turning in a similar way to different ideas of rights. When he wrote what he did. So you need to actually, this is why I think, and it's like I'm following the footsteps of giants who study the American founding here, that you can't simply look in the immediate you can't ignore the immediate historical context, only a dunce would do that, but you want to locate the founding of a political enterprise in terms of political philosophy and the big ideas, right? Because that's the sea in which these people swim. We're in better versions or worse versions. Sometimes they're slave. You could say Beham, who probably hadn't read the second treatise of government, was a slave to a dead political philosopher. To alter that phrase on the everyone is a slave to a dead economist. But if you're really going to understand that effort, you have to understand that what is a Lockean liberalism? What are individual natural rights as Locke articulates them? So that's more, to me, John Locke is a more important figure for understanding the founding of Israel than Herzl is at the level of ideas, not at the level of the historical process. Another mega controversial claim in some circles, but anyway, that's what I'm trying to argue here.
So my second question, I think, is probably linked with my unfamiliarity with political theory, but when we think about some of the universals that you were thinking about and the natural rights and the freedoms that are the ideals of declarations of independence, if you talked about those ideals and natural rights and freedoms with many African Americans and indigenous peoples, you would get a very different view of what that ideal means and how it was played out, in a sense, or how it was lived.
Yeah.
And so I guess I'm kind of wondering, how do we fit these ideals with kind of the abyss of what doesn't happen or where we end? Because I would argue that there's not complete freedom of speech in Israel today.
Yeah.
So what do we do?
Yeah, I mean, the way, that's in a way part of the whole drama of human life, right? Is you have principles, and sometimes you have two good principles and they're in competition with one another, right? And you're trapped in the middle. But I think the drama is one poignant kind of drama is when you have good principles and you don't live up to them, right? And you have efforts, noble, extremely noble efforts, which we see in American history. You say forcing us to live up to noble or true ideas which were articulated, but which were for reasons of compromise or reasons of moral failings or whatever have you, were not fully realized at the founding. And of course that requires us to investigate these principles and say, are they true? Are they good? And then that's a debate we need to have. But assuming they are, in a way, they do have value. As putting my cards on the table, I do think these ideas of individual natural rights do have value in this sense. To me, they what one does, and what the example of in the United States, Frederick Douglass and others, you use those as a cudgel against this is work of liberation. How you look what the slave, what use have I for the principles of July 4th? These are good principles. Why aren't you living up to them, right? And you look in that context, like those principles have done extraordinary work, I think, in this way, right? So I would look at it at the same way. Of course, it's the case that there are either some practical, you're in a war, like Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, things, practical necessities, these things, you're in a deadlock, you're in conflict over a piece of obviously there's both necessity and circumstance, and also just clear moral failings, venality. And one view of prudence is, moving our politics in the direction of, right principles of right as far as possible. And, in the American case, I can't think of a better example than Frederick Douglass, who did that.
All right, well, I'll take the prerogative of the last question. Your book is just so fun because, when you look at the cover, right, you see this very somber, august group of people. They're all dressed up. And when you think of our own Declaration of Independence, you imagine the founders and maybe music is playing and like the stars are aligned. It's just this great, And then when you read the actual history, it's like an episode of The Office. It's just crazy how contingent and how kind of slapdash and how just last minute so much of this was. So anyway, my question is, what has been the historical reception of this document afterward? Is it the kind of thing that people look back on and sort of hold in reverence and think, wow, our Declaration of Independence is such a key and wonderful document? Or, since it is so recent, do people, and they know kind of the history of it, do they look back and they think, oh, look, just Ben Gurion just kind of tossed that off at the last minute. Yeah. People were just racing around. It's not.
They didn't know the history of it. That's.
They just did. Okay,
so it's an interesting. So this couldn't have been done more. This is a product of the last 15 years when the archives are open. This first draft was only basically uncovered in the mid 2000s.
So right? People really do hold the Declaration in reverence and use it a lot in their arguments. It's not considered a sort of a kind of a pedestrian sort of just document.
Yeah, no. Really, so this is new. There's a whole story there also. It's actually in line, I think, with my comment that we were mentioning earlier that how does founderism develop? It takes it can't take some time for it to pass for this possibility to emerge, whether for good or ill, depending on your perspective. But the story of Israel's Declaration of Independence in Israeli history is interesting in that way. It was immediately taken up by the Supreme Court of Israel in its early years, and it was like the footage of this grainy footage of Ben Gurion reading it. It was like a feature of sort of like the collective life of the state, but it wasn't actually. It didn't have the role that America's Declaration of Independence has had at various times in American history, especially beginning with Lincoln and Lincoln's construction of a civil religion based on the Declaration. But that's really changed over the last recent years, and over the last I got any author you want your book it's just like this book happened to launch at the moment of constitutional crisis in Israel, where the Declaration all of a sudden from being it's been growing over I think the last 15 to 20 years, but it's now become in a way this kind of almost reverent document with reverence. In December, the mayor of Tel Aviv had an 11-foot copy of the Declaration produced, and he hung it over the mayoralty in Tel Aviv. Right, wow. That's wild. Again, very good for the book's coming out in Hebrew. We'll see how it'll be good for books. First book with this title, Hebrew. So maybe that'll be good for my purposes, but that's kind of an interesting story as well, why they've turned to it as well. And I think the reason is that it kind of has its reason is its strength and its flaw. It has something for everything. It's been invoked by the sort of liberal camp in current Israel, who point to sort of the universalistic side of individual rights. Let us do what we want. Let's freedom from religion, etc. But it's not actually opposed by the right or the religious side either, right? Because they see elements in there which they also. It's not as if with very few exceptions, we're little bit is growing as there is everywhere in the world. But most religious people in Israel are not they're not anti-religious freedom. They're not anti. They say, yeah, no, I'm liberal. I respect the equality of all, and they're happy with its clear statement that this is a Jewish state. Well, Jewish state capaciously defined, not defining what that means. So it has something for all sides. It's certainly liable to be misinterpreted, but I think you need something. At the level of principles. And this is the only thing in Israeli history. There's no subject. My next book, Constitution of Israel, there was no formal constitution written in 1948. There are no Federalist Papers of Israel. There are no other things which you could look for to say, hey, I mean, there are some anyway, there are some smaller things, but this is really the principal statement of principles at the founding of Israel. So I sort of think it was kind of inevitable that it would now attain this stage, which it has attained.
All right, well, let's thank Neil Rogachevsky for his wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much.